Hello BookTube. This is part 19 of my 2022 library tour and the 7th part of the history shelves. So let's get going. First of all, I have on this particular shelf Lakota America, A New History of Indigenous Power by Pekka Hämäläinen. This is a history of the Lakota peoples from the mid 17th century to the near present. It's what I read it for my name tag TBR as part of No Fiction 2022, and if you've been following along from those videos, I did end up bailing on this. But from what I read, this is how you do Indigenous history. It is deeply researched, deeply written. It is dense, and rather interesting. So, next is This Vast Southern Empire, Slaveholders at the Helm of American Foreign Policy by Matthew Karp. I read this book, I think in 2017 or 2018, and really enjoyed it and wanted it in my collection, and I picked it up in, I think, 2020. It's about how the South dominated American politics for much of the 19th century, particularly with regards to foreign policy. And it is really good. But it has been quite a while since I've read it, so I really need to have another go at it. Next is The World Turned Upside Down, A History of the Chinese Cultural Revolution by Yang Jixing. We saw his book, Tombstone, I think on Wednesday. Let me go look. Nope, yesterday. It was yesterday. And much as with Tombstone, The World Turned Upside Down is a deeply researched, deeply written, brutal history of, in this case, the Cultural Revolution, the decade of turmoil in which Chinese society was turned on its head as the upper echelons of the Communist Party and the middle cadres were in conflict with radicalized students, and how Mao sort of shifted support from side to side as his political needs dictated. This is a very, very fascinating history. It was one of my favorites from last year and highly, highly recommended. Next is another one of my favorites from last year, If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future by Jill Lepore. This is a fascinating history of a little-known company called Simulmatics that aimed to be able to create mathematical models to be able to predict human activities, to predict polling and to add in polling and advertising, and sort of to predict how humans will react to certain things. What we now call the algorithm. It was originated with Simulmatics, and this is a very fascinating slice of 1960s and early 1970s history. It is fantastic. I love Jill Lepore's work. I've read a number of her books by now, and I've loved all of them. Next is yet another favorite book from last year. This was actually my third favorite book from last year, A World Beneath the Sands, The Golden Age of Egyptology by Toby Wilkinson. This is the history of Egyptology and of Egypt from the late 18th century up to the 1920s. Really the foundational years of Egyptology, and it is a fantastic book. I loved every moment I spent with this book. It is just wonderful. Next is A History of the Vikings. This is Children of Ash and Elm by Neil Price. This is a very fascinating look at the Vikings in the countries that are now Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and also Denmark. From the don't quite remember the spread, but it is a very fascinating book and deeply researched and deeply well done. I really enjoyed it. Next is The Last Shah, America, Iran, and the Fall of the Pahlavi Dynasty by Ray Takei. This is a very fascinating history of the Pahlavi Dynasty and the fall of Reza Shah, the last Shah of Iran. So really enjoyed it. Next is Magic, A History from Alchemy to Witchcraft from the Ice Age to the Present by Chris Gosden. This is a history of magic that kind of reads magic as a sort of means of knowing the world, and a sort of a tripod relationship to science and religion, and how this sort of tripod relationship has been, for the most part, rather shaky. So I'm of mixed opinions about the book. On the one hand, it is fascinating, particularly the prehistoric history. That is incredibly fascinating, and I loved it. Some of the more recent sort of aspects of it may be a bit disappointing, I think. And I think certain regions do get short shrift. If I remember correctly, I think Africa, the Americas, I think are combined in a single chapter. And I think all of Asia has a chapter on its own. And really only up to sort of Qin Shi Huang. Maybe a little bit later than that, but it's not really a huge amount of like more recent stuff on China. So yeah. So I mean, it's fascinating, but it's a particular interpretation of magic that may or may not be everyone's cup of tea. And it does get a little bit of the woo-woo in it. So anyway, next is The Crown and Crisis, Countdown to the Abdication by Alexander Larman. This is, I think, a brilliant history of the months leading up to the abdication of Edward VIII, his relationship with Wallace Simpson, and all of the sort of players who were involved in the abdication crisis. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. Next is Square Haunting, 5 Writers in London Between the Wars by Francesca Wade. This is, I guess you could say it's a group biography of 5 writers. Dorothy L. Sayers, H.D., Virginia Woolf, I I'm blinking on the other two. Sorry about that. I don't know why my stomach is growling. I just had lunch. Oh, Jane Ellen Harrison and Eileen Power are the other two. And it's a group biography of these 5 women during the time between the World Wars when they lived on, I think it's Mecklenburg Square in London, and how this square and these 5 women sort of were important to the for feminist history. I picked this book up for the Book 2 prize. It was, I think it was in Group A from last year. Or, I mean, it was in my Octofinals group. I don't remember if I was in Group A or not, but it was my Octofinals group, and this was one of the books I had to pick up for it, and I liked it well enough, although by the time I got to Virginia Woolf, I was a bit tired of it. And so it was my number 1, but it's an advised number 1. It's okay, but it didn't really impress me all that much, I will say. Next is Revolution in the Netherlands, the 80 Years' War, 1568 to 1648, by Anton van der Lim. This is a history of the Dutch Revolt that I haven't gotten around to yet. I picked it up. I think this was part of my first order with the University of Chicago Press. Next is Raised to Rule, Educating Royalty at the Court of the Spanish Habsburgs, 1601 to 1634, by Martha K. Hoffman. This is a very fascinating book about the education of the eventual Philip IV of Spain and his siblings, and how they learned to be a monarch, how to be a queen, how to serve their older brother and his ambitions, his directives, or in the case of his sisters, how to become queens of their respective realms. And it's a very fascinating. I quite enjoyed it. It does start off a bit shaky, but once I got into it, it was really fascinating. Next is another book I picked up from the University of Chicago Press in that first order. This is The Water Kingdom, A Secret History of China by Philip Ball, which I need to get to. And next is another one of my favorite books from last year. This is The History of Bhutan by Karma Funcho. This is an amazing history of Bhutan. I really loved it. I mean, it does start off a bit rocky, but once the history proper begins, it's an amazing read. Just absolutely amazing. And next is a mammoth of a book. This is The Enlightenment, The Pursuit of Happiness, 1680 to 1790, by Richie Robertson. I haven't gotten around to it yet. It came out early last year, and I kind of had my eye on it and eventually picked it up, but I haven't gotten to it yet. I'm thinking of maybe reading this for probably not March of the Mammoths. There's another book I'm thinking of reading for that, but yeah, probably try to get to it at some point. Next is The Chinese in America, A Narrative History by Iris Cheng. Haven't gotten around to it yet, but I hope to soon. And then there is She-Wolves, The Women Who Ruled England Before Elizabeth by Helen Castor. I haven't gotten around to this one yet either, but I'm looking forward to it. I'm rather interested in reading about a number of these queens. And then I have a biography of Cleopatra. This is Cleopatra the Great, the Woman Behind the Legend by Joanne Fletcher. I love Joanne Fletcher's The Story of Egypt, and I wanted to pick this up as well. I know there's a biography of Cleopatra by Stacey Schiff that a lot of readers of history seem to love. I read it a few years ago and I really wasn't all that impressed with it. But I mean, I might give it another go and I might add it to have another Cleopatra biography. But I mean, I quite like Fletcher's writing style, and I really wasn't all that impressed with Schiff's. Although that said, I'm not entirely sure you really should call Cleopatra the Great. Anyway, thoughts for another day. Next up is American Empire, A Global History by A.G. Hopkins. I picked this up from Princeton University Press a few months ago and need to get to it. And next is another favorite book of mine from last year. This is The Age of Decadence, A History of Britain, 1880 to 1914 by Simon Heffer. This is a wonderful history of Britain from the late in Victoria's reign to the beginning of World War I. It is wonderful. I loved every moment I spent with this huge book. Just every moment. And finally, the last book on this shelf, and another favorite book of mine from last year, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America by Clint Smith. This is a fascinating look at the history of racism in America through the lens of a number of tourist attractions that Clint Smith goes to, and where he interacts with the people who are tour guides, who operate it, who manage it, who direct it. It's a really fascinating book. I quite enjoyed it. So that concludes part 7 of history. I'll be back next week to begin wrapping up history. There are 4 more parts of history. So today I'm finishing up what I call History 1, which is this bookcase here and this bookcase under it. Next week I will begin with the wrapping up of the history section by moving over to History 2, which is this bookcase here. So we'll be working on that, or I'll be working on that up from Monday through Thursday, and then we'll be done with history, and then we can begin the final part of the library tour, my monstrous science fiction and fantasy section, which is going to be a while, because it's pretty much the other half of my collection. So until then, BookTube, thank you, have a great afternoon, stay safe, and I will see you shortly with weekly reads. So until then, BookTube, thank you.